Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the speaker series, the Trinity Club of Hartford. Tonight's series is the election 2022. The people have spoken. What did they say? As we get started today, we will have Professor Renny Fulco will be our guest speaker, and Matt will be our moderator. I am Carmen Leslie-Rourke. It is my honor to be the president of the Trinity Club of Hartford. And I will introduce Matt, our moderator. He has a long history of being part of the Trinity family. His father graduated from Trinity College. His mother received her master's from Trinity. 5 out of 8 of Matt's siblings also graduated from Trinity College. And Matt met his wife, Ellen Carpenter Smith, at Trinity. And recently, in 2019, their daughter, Diana Rose, graduated from Trinity College. Matt will now begin our speaker series. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carmen. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Our talk will be followed by a question and answer session, so please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. The Trinity Club of Hartford Speaker Series is dedicated to informing and educating members of the Trinity College community about issues central to Trinity's vitality. The objective of the series is to provide an honest view of an issue from an informed perspective. Tonight, we will cover a very timely subject, the 2022 election. This is an election whose complete results are still outstanding 9 days following Election Day. The 2022 election's one indisputable quality is that its results seem consistent with the past number of elections. That is, America as a whole remains very divided. However, a closer look at 2022's election results can reveal telling information about what Americans value and how we want our nation to proceed. Leading us through this review is Professor Renny Fulco, an associate professor and director of public policy and law program at Trinity College. She teaches courses that focus on the intersection of law, politics, and public policy. She offers a broad range of courses on topics that include constitutional rights and liberties, the Supreme Court, and gender discrimination. Professor Fulco is also the faculty coordinator of the Legal Studies minor and often advises students interested in attending law school. Some of her recent courses include Federalism and Public Policy, Title IX, Changing Campus Culture and Law, Gender, and the Supreme Court. Professor Fulco received her BA from Boston University and her PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Professor Fulco has presented her works at professional conferences in the United States and abroad, and has served as a political commentator for local and national media. Her most recent publications, which focus on the religion, law, and public policy, have appeared in the Journal of Church and State and Connecticut Law Review. This background makes Professor Fulco uniquely qualified to examine the 2022 election results and share her view on what American voters said they wanted for themselves, their families, and our country. So with that introduction, Renny, I will turn it over to you. I could ask a lot of questions to start us off, but I will keep it simple with what happened. And just before you begin, I want to remind our audience to type their questions for Professor Fulco into the Q&A box at the bottom of their screens. So Professor Fulco, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I would also like to thank Carmen and the Trinity Club of Hartford for doing this. And I would also like to thank Bonnie Walters in the alumni office for getting us all organized. And she did a masterful job to make sure we were all set and know exactly what we're doing here tonight, which is a good thing on Zoom. So let me also thank everybody who's in the audience. I'm delighted that people are taking time out of this Thursday night to be with us, quite frankly. And I have to say, Matt has posed a difficult question, the question of what happened in this midterm election of 2022. And I'm just going to begin by talking about what the expectations were. And then I'm going to talk about several going to speak briefly about several specific points that I think are particularly relevant to answering Matt's question. And then I think at that point, we'll be able to turn it over so that you can ask your questions. So I'm going to begin by saying something I think everybody who's probably listening already knew, that the expectations among many pollsters was very clear going into this midterm election. It was a narrative that had, I think, gained a lot of consensus as people began to think about what was going to happen on November 8th. And the narrative, for the most part, with a few exceptions, was that Republicans would sweep to victory. They would take back control of the House and Senate, and they would win important state races for governor, attorney general, secretary of state, especially in important battleground or swing states, including Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And again, I think this was a consensus narrative. I think there were a few voices that expressed different points of view. And if anyone wants to know who those people are, I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But this was the narrative. And certainly this is the narrative that the media was running with. And so if you want to ask why was that the narrative, that was the narrative because it's the conventional wisdom. Namely, that in midterm elections, these off-year elections where there is generally lower voter turnout, when a president is unpopular, and sometimes even when a president isn't unpopular, it is likely that the president's party will lose seats, certainly in the House and Senate. And part of the popular wisdom or the conventional wisdom as well is that if a president is unpopular, and by that I mean not having approval ratings over 50%, which may not sound like a lot, but below 50% is often where we say a president is underwater. When there are economic headwinds, like skyrocketing gas prices and rampant inflation, it is likely that the party in power will lose seats. And this has been the case historically. So in 2006, George W. Bush was president, and his party lost 6 seats in the Senate in the midterm and 30 seats in the House. In 2010, Obama was president. The Democrats lost 6 seats in the Senate and 63 seats in the House, an enormous number. In 2014, another midterm election, when Obama was president, his party lost 9 Senate seats and 13 seats in the House. And finally, in 2018, although Trump gained under Trump in his off-term election, his off-year election, they gained 1 Senate seat, but they lost 34, the Republicans, in the House. So as you can see, there's a pattern. And when people talk about elections, they rely upon this kind of data as they think about the current situation. Now, as we know, we do have an exception this year. Democrats held the Senate in the sense that it's 50-50, and Vice President Harris will cast a vote if necessary, and we still have the Georgia runoff. In the House, Republicans so far have gained 6 seats, and there are 7 left, and we know that although Republicans will retain the House, they will retain the majority, it's by a very small margin, and that was not predicted. Indeed, as we know, people were talking about the red wave. And if you want to see a good example of an after the fact image of the red wave, look at this week's New Yorker cover. It has a very good cover about what happened to the red wave. And so now, if we ask the question, why? Why did this happen? I'm going to focus on 3 or 4 main points. And number one, I think the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, was extremely important. And that took place in June. I also think we have to look at the role of the independent voters and the youth vote, which is very interesting in this election. I think we also have to look at the, quote, Trump effect, and tied to the Trump effect, some of the very poor candidates who Republicans actually put up during this election cycle. And then finally, I think we want to look at the question of election deniers. So let me begin with just a little bit of information about the impact of that Dobbs decision. Beginning in June, it was very clear. June 23rd, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and it became clear very, very quickly that many people were upset about this decision, women in particular, and that they were angry and that they were getting mobilized. And some of you may remember that over the summer, there was a Kansas vote about whether or not to eliminate protection for abortion in the Kansas Constitution. And surprisingly, in this very red state, abortion protections remained. Voters voted to save that right and save those protections. And so that was one indication to me that the Dobbs decision was going to be extremely important in this election. And one of the other factors that we noted in the run-up to the election is that women were registering in large numbers. And that was a signal that not only were women upset, but that women were ready to vote. And this became clear, especially in states where abortion rights seemed to be on the line. And what I mean by that is in states where abortion protections might go away if Democrats were not elected to office, because it became clear in this period that Republicans were standing by the Supreme Court decision. And indeed, some Republicans really doubled down. You may recall that Lindsey Graham at one point said there should be a federal ban on abortion. So this was a really important issue. And if we look at the exit polls, what we see is that women did in fact vote, and that on this question of abortion. And the Kaiser Family Foundation did a survey specifically on the question of abortion. And what they discovered is that for 29% of women, the overturning of Roe was the most important factor. For 43% of women, it affected whether or not they would vote at all, the overturning of Roe. And for 53% of women, it had an effect, this Roe question, the overturning of Roe, affected their candidate choice. And so I think that is one factor which very clearly had an impact on the outcome of this election. And it was an unusual issue in the sense that although abortion is always a question that Democrats and Republicans disagree about, in this instance, a right that women had had for more than 40 years was now no longer there. And it should be noted that 52% of the electorate in the midterms was comprised of women. So they were 52% of the electorate. The second point I would like to mention is the role of independent voters. 30% of midterm voters were independents. And independents had a particularly large impact on close races in what we call the battleground states or the swing states. This was true in Pennsylvania and Nevada, where we have a lot of, where we have some exit polling data already. And independent voters tended to also care about the question of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so we want to keep that in mind as well. In addition, we want to look at the youth vote in this election. And as I always tell my students, you know, you're young, but you need to register. If any of my former students are out there, I haven't had a chance to look yet, you'll remember my saying this. I don't care who you vote for, register, vote, become a good citizen. And according to the Tufts University poll, which they did, and they track young voters in every election, they said that in this election, although the youth vote wasn't quite as high as it was in 2018, in the group of 18 to 29-year-olds, 63% voted for Democrats in the House of Representatives. And I give you that as an example because I think what it shows is that in close races, both independents and the youth vote could have a big impact. And we know, as Matt said at the beginning, you know, America remains divided. Many of these races were close. And so I found those two, specifically looking at independents and the youth vote, to be very important. And I'm going to continue to track this as we get more data from more states. The next point I would like to mention, and this is something that we all discussed as we were planning this, is what I'm going to call the Trump effect. And this particular midterm was unusual because you had a former president who was playing an outsized role. And not only did you have a former president, but you had a former president who didn't get reelected in the 2020 election. I mean, that's what the facts show. I think he still continues to argue that he did get reelected, but he didn't. And so what that means is that you had this unusual, I would say, exacerbation of the kind of polarization that Matt has already mentioned. In other words, it was like Trump was on the ballot. And frankly, many Republicans would have preferred that Biden be the one that everybody was focused on, and high, you know, the rate of inflation and the high gas prices and other things. But Trump inserted himself into this election in such a way that Nate Cohn, and some of you might read him in the New York Times, he does polling for the New York Times, and he has determined that Republicans, he calls them MAGA Republicans, the Republicans who really towed the Trump line during this election, underperformed by 5 points in this election. And that he concludes that that was a drag on many Republicans who were running for office, again, especially in a polarized environment. And he published a piece this week in which he said non-MAGA Republicans ran 6 points better than Trump did in 2020. And that's really something for us to think about, that if you weren't associated with Trump, you actually did better in this election. And that had significant consequences for the House, the Senate, governor's races, secretaries of state races, etc. And so we want to think about what that means, and if if we want to understand why maybe the polling didn't account for all of this, is because we've never really had a situation where a former president played such an outsized role in the election. And even when he was, I think, when there was criticism of his, continued, backing of candidates who didn't seem to be the best, he was not moved by what others were saying, which, I don't think will surprise anyone, but it certainly had an effect. And it also had an effect on candidate choice, right? And we know now that there are Republicans, and certainly Mitch McConnell said from the very beginning of this cycle, that candidate quality really mattered. And so the other measure that I would like to talk about here was a category that I would call election deniers. And many of the people who Trump supported were, in fact, election deniers, right? And they were on the ballot all over the country. And I have to say that there were 150 election deniers even running in the House of Representatives. In other words, people who still continued to say what Trump said, who did get elected or who were projected to win as of a couple days ago. But I think it's important for us to look at how the election deniers affected state races, which are so important going forward. And I think this is another, if you want to say what happened in this election, I think we can look at what happened nationally, and that's very important. But we also want to look at what happened at the state level. And so if we look at the fate of election deniers in battleground states, and here I would include Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, what we find is that the election deniers lost most of the top races in those battleground states. And that's extremely important. If we think about what it would have meant if people who actually denied the results of the 2020 election and who had committed themselves to changing the rules in their states, either as governor or secretary of state or attorney general, that none of those people actually won in those battleground states. It's a different story in red states. But in battleground states, we can see that voters rejected the claims of election deniers, and that is also an important result in this election. In addition, it should be noted that for the first time in 40 years in the state of Michigan, the state legislature now has been claimed by the Democrats, and they will have the governor and they will have the two houses of the Michigan legislature. If we look at Pennsylvania, as everybody I'm sure who is here tonight understands and knows, we know that in that Senate race, the Democrat won. We know that in the governor's race, the Democrat won. We see the same thing in Arizona, where the Democrat won in the Senate seat in Arizona, and at least the governor's race has been called. I understand that Carrie Lake has said that she's going to go to court and try to bring some kind of legal action. But as of today, Katie Hobbs has won that race. If we look at Nevada, we can see that the Senate race, again, was held by the Democrat. And so I think if we look at those results and we look at the Trump effect and we look at the election deniers, and then we think about the role that more moderate voters, particularly independent voters, may have played in this election, it may give us a clue. I can't fully answer Matt's question, but I think it's at least part of the answer to the question. And what I thought I would do in closing is I would like to read something that Mitch McConnell said a couple days ago. McConnell was asked what happened, and many of you may have heard what he said, but I would like to read this to you. He said, "We underperformed among independents and moderates because their impression of many of the people in our party and leadership roles is that they're dogged in chaos, negativity, excessive attacks," he told reporters at the Capitol following a closed-door caucus meeting. And this is what he said. So he and I agree. He said, "And it frightened independent and moderate Republican voters." And I think that's a good place to end so that we can take some questions. But I think, frankly, McConnell said he looked at the polling data. I'm sure he looked at some of the polling data that I looked at, and I had prepared this before he made the comment, and I just had to read that to you because I think Mitch McConnell is one of the more astute, readers of what is going on in elections. And so I am pleased to see that we at least agree on the analysis. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much.
Oh, fabulous, Renny. Thank you. Wonderfully detailed summary as well. A lot of great facts backing up your information there. In fact, David Blattner asked the question, do you think in aggregate, Americans sort of like a divided government? In other words, do Americans like having divided government in order to force compromise and force both parties to go closer to the center?
What I would say is, in theory, I think that's what Americans like. And if you ask them, they will tell you that's what they like. So they like that idea. But, and again, if I were doing this, 20 years ago, I might have said something different. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is, and this comes back to, Matt, what you said, we're so polarized that what divided government tends to do is lead to gridlock. And it leads to gridlock on almost every issue that matters. And I think sometimes it's good to slow things down. But I think on other times it can be really, really difficult if you can't get compromise. And I think what you see, if you're just watching kind of Kevin McCarthy, I think it's going to be hard enough for him to deal with his own caucus. Mm. And I think the problem is that if you have a divided caucus, that makes it even more difficult to come to the table with the other party to have something to negotiate. And so I foresee, at least in the initial phases here, problems, around compromise. But I do think that in terms of the question I was asked, I do think this is what people at least believe they want, because they think that it's a way to force people to compromise. And I think that's what many Americans want. So if divided government is a way to force compromise and have more moderate policies, I think that's what most Americans really do want.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. As you were, taking into account these drivers of the results, or why we got the results we did, early voting, any view into how that has changed election dynamics? I think it was at a level much higher than it was certainly 2 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, and that's a complicated question. I haven't seen yet, and I don't know if they have broken it down yet. I will certainly look and get back, if I can find this, to everybody who's interested, because it's such an important question. Clearly, early voting has had an impact, and part of the impact is we don't know the results still in 6 races. And one of the main reasons we don't know is because of mail-in votes, right? In other words, that states that weren't accustomed to voting, having as much mail-in voting, don't always have the rules in place to have efficient counting of those ballots, because it used to be more like what it is in Connecticut in a lot of states, right? Mm-hmm. That in order to mail in a ballot and do early voting that's mail-in, and then we'll talk about the in-person, but to do it, still in Connecticut, you have to have an excuse. Now, again, they said COVID could be an excuse this time, but it typically was what? It was people who had to be out of the country, or who, really couldn't get to the polls, or who were in the army, right? Who were in the armed forces. But now we have more states that have allowed for early voting. And I think part of the problem is that in a lot of states, it's not counted as quickly as it is, quite frankly, in Florida. And I heard a big pitch the other day for voting the way they do in Florida, because they count the early votes as they come in, whereas some states have it that you can't count them till all the other votes are in. Okay. So in terms of early voting, there's no question that people like it. People love the idea that they don't have to go on that one day. And again, the only issue with this, it's state by state, and states get to decide whether they will allow it or not.
Right. Well, yeah. And I remember a comment, and I heard this years ago, that the best way to get more of compromise and move towards the center is to broaden the electorate. And that's one of the things that early voting seems to have done, just from a numbers standpoint, is it's gotten more voices, people expressing their voices at the ballot box.
Right, but there are some, there are some states that are working against that for a variety of reasons. Not all states are looking to, make it more accessible. So that's part of the problem. I mean, we took a little mini step in Connecticut this year to at least, make access more available.
Okay. Brendan Clark asks, hi, Professor Fulco. Thanks for your comments.
Brendan. I wish I could see you, but I can't, but I picture you.
His question is, given the timing of the Dobbs decision within a midterm year, a one-time occurrence of sorts, is the Dobbs effect of limited significance going forward, or do you see Democratic groups working to keep this issue active as an electoral issue in the next cycle?
Okay, so Brendan, leave it to you to ask me that kind of question, and very, very professional and a tough one. So I'm going to tell you, unsurprisingly, what I really think. So what I really think is that abortion is not like a lot of other issues. And it's not just abortion. It's reproductive health more broadly. And women and men deal with reproductive health every day. It's not like an issue that you deal with it once in a great while. It's something that women deal with on a personal basis every single day. And my guess is that so long as we have states that are continuing to further restrict reproductive rights, I think that this issue will remain alive. And it's because it's one of the most deeply personal issues imaginable. And I think that the way the Democrats framed this as a matter of personal freedom has been very effective. And we also know that there's going to be ongoing litigation, for as long as we can imagine on this. And so I do think it's going to remain a very important issue. And I've heard commentary from people, who are very much involved in this on the national level, on the state level. And I know that they will continue to make this an issue well into 2024. Whether it will have the same impact is a different question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mary Lou and Joe Ambrose Barkley comment, excellent presentation. Could you comment on the elections of Secretary of State for those states which actually elect people for this position?
The Secretary of State that elect?
Mm-hmm.
I think that I have to tell you, just when I don't know, I don't know. I have to look at the National Council of State Legislatures, whatever it is, so I could find out exactly which would be which, or Ballotpedia. But many states elect the Secretary of State. There are a few states that have a different system, but I think it's pretty common. But I just have to say, I honestly can't give an answer to that question. But I think what we're learning is this is an increasingly important position in ways that we never imagined that it would be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tapping into your background and work observing and studying the Supreme Court, Sabrina Dunlop asks, thank you for this excellent presentation, Renny. How worried are you about the Supreme Court taking the independent state legislature theory case, which Moore v. Harper? Do you think this court will adopt the theory and give state legislatures unrestricted authority to set rules for federal elections? It seems like at best this will lead to chaos, and at worst it could result in further erosion of trust in elections and democratic norms. Thank you.
Hi, Sabrina. Another tough question. Wow. So am I worried? Yeah, I'm worried. I'm worried because this theory of independent state legislatures kind of came out of nowhere. Some law review articles and some ideas that I think some very conservative lawyers have. And for those of you who don't know, I think Sabrina has given us a really good definition. I put up the chat just so, because I want to make sure I get exactly what she says. So this means that state legislatures have unrestricted authority to set the rules for federal elections, and they can overrule others. And this seems to me to be a very bizarre reading of certainly what the Constitution requires. But I think that there are probably some on the Supreme Court, and we could probably name them, because they have spoken favorably that this might be something that, favorably about this idea, and something that they think could be possible. So just so everyone understands, it would mean that the state legislatures could essentially decide questions having to do with electoral votes, right? Anything that has to do with federal elections. And so do I think that this could result in further erosion of trust in elections and democratic norms? Yes. I'm glad you didn't ask me what I thought the court might do, because I'm not sure yet, but I do think this is a very troubling case.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And something we should all be paying attention to, because it isn't a question of being conservative or liberal. It's a question about where does the authority to decide elections really lie? Mm-hmm. Is it with the people, or is it somehow now with state legislatures? I don't think most of us probably think about our state legislatures in quite that way.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to what you were talking about is one of the effects, the Trump effect, and why we had the results we did. Peter Kinsler asks, in previous times when it seemed as if Republicans would reject Trump, such as the Hollywood tape and the January 6th insurrection, they would not break from him because their elections depended on his support. Do you think it will make a difference now that Trump cost them the Senate and hurt their hold on the House?
I think this is a great question. It's so hard to know what's going to happen because Trump doesn't act like other people, sort of in the political arena. And I do think at least it seems that, he still is quite popular among at least a certain segment of the Republican Party. And what we have to remember is that what's going to matter here are the primaries. And, one of the things that Trump was able to do, in 2016 was just knock out all his opponents, and nobody coalesced around a single person. So if you have a large field, I think it can be easy, given the way the Republican primary process works, for Trump to actually succeed in getting nominated. I think there will be many who will be opposed to this, but the way the primary process works, it makes it easier. Now, if other Republicans coalesce around a single candidate, then I think it can become more difficult. But I think if you have this big field, he just has to win a plurality in most states in order to be successful. And it's not yet clear to me. I mean, I think Mitch McConnell got off the Trump train, but it's not clear to me that everybody else has done that yet.
Okay. And then Bhamika Chowdhury asks, Professor Fulco, always a joy to learn from you outside the classroom too. How will Nancy Pelosi's decision to not pursue a leadership position in the caucus impact Congress, or what ripple effects will it have?
Bhumika, how are you? I hope well. So it's always a pleasure to know that you're listening. How about that? So I haven't had time to digest the Pelosi news yet, but I'll take a stab at it. I think I predicted this. Especially once her husband was so horribly, was a victim of that horrible assault. I mean, it seemed to me that I thought that if the Democrats had somehow hung on, she might have, stayed in her position. But it seemed to me, I don't know how many of you heard the interview she had, but the interview I saw with her, I think it was on CNN. Did anybody? Well, you can't tell me if you did, but if you didn't, you should see it. She was so visibly shaken by that it seemed to me she just wasn't going to go forward. And I also think she understands that it's time to turn it over to a younger generation. And it's what I saw today was a pretty tight-knit group of Democrats when she made her announcement. I think that it's going to be a pretty easy transition. I mean, they've agreed upon who the new leadership will be. I'm sure there will still be divisions. But when I compare that to what's going on in the Republican caucus, it just seems to me that they will, at least I think they'll have a chance to remain united. And I think that's very important if they're in the minority. But will they miss somebody with her skill set? I would say yes.
Very good. James Fleming, just kind of building off Pelosi's decision and announcement. Jim Fleming asks, will there be gridlock now that the Republicans control the House? Also, will the left control the Democratic caucus now that that Pelosi is stepping down? Will Biden be a target of the left?
Hi, Jim. That's a multi-part question. Again, I said a little earlier, so some of this, I may have already answered, but I do think that there will be a lot of gridlock. And I think that, I don't know that the left will necessarily control the caucus. I think it may be there's certainly going to be more representation of the left at the leadership levels, given, who's going to, I think because of what what the transition to the new, the new leadership will look like. I'm not sure that Biden is going to be a target in the House. I mean, for Democrats, I think Democrats are going to be defending Biden, because I heard that, what I heard tonight is that the first thing on their list is to, have an investigation of his son and then, possibly impeach Biden. So I don't think that the Democrats will be critical of Biden in that context.
Okay. And then Chase Anderson, just continuing with an exploration of this issue, is there a way to get to compromise moderation without congressional stagnation and gridlock in this political environment? By the way, Chase does say hi, Renny.
And I say hi right back, Chase. How are you? So what do I think? I mean, I think I've spoken about this a little bit. And I think at this moment, it's going to be really hard, because I think that the Republicans have said what it is they're going to do. And they said that what they want to do is have oversight. Now, oversight means investigations, and both parties do investigations. So this is not something Republicans on their own do. But I think it comes back to what I said earlier in response to some of the questions. I think, Matt, it may have been what you are, that the Republicans didn't focus on a lot of the kinds of issues that need to be addressed in Congress. I mean, I think, some of the stuff, certainly election denial is not something, that I think is going to be taken up, although they may. I mean, who knows? But my concern is that they're going to use the oversight function, to do investigations rather than focus, I think, on many of the issues that people really care about. And it comes back to the fact that they didn't focus on those things as much as they needed to during the midterm elections.
Okay. All right. And then again, Hillary Davidson. Hi, Professor Fulco. It's Hillary Davidson, 89. Great to see you and great presentation. One of the top lines from this election, which you discussed, is that many election deniers did not win, thanks in part to independent voters. But some of those races were frighteningly close. And so do you see reason for concern for the future? I worry that it is too soon to declare victory for democracy, particularly given the amount of disinformation.
Hi, Hillary. As always, thoughtful and well-spoken. It's amazing to see how Trinity alums I put the chat up, so I just, and I see it's amazing. Like they're writing like an essay. It's terrific. I'm delighted. And so I think I agree that they didn't win. And I think I'm with you, Hillary. I don't think that we're like in safe territory yet, because there are still people out there, spouting complete nonsense. And, we haven't even talked about the role of social media in all of this, right? And that it isn't, that people are getting their information in so many ways that, to call it even information, it's not information. There's a lot of just nonsense that people believe. And I do think that we do have cause to worry. It is too soon to declare victory for democracy, although I think this was a good step for democracy. I mean, compared to the alternative, this was a fabulous step for democracy, that, we didn't end up with a bunch of people denying. And in addition, I think with the exception of Kerry Lake and a couple of others, almost all the Republicans who lost in these close contests conceded. Now, let me just make clear that you still take the oath of office if you get elected, whether your opponent concedes or not. But I think it was a return to a simple democratic norm that matters. That if you lose an election, you admit you lost the election. And that's the end of the story. I mean, I realize we have a guy in a red hat in Florida who's still, going on and on about that. But, it's a tiny step, Hillary, but I think it really matters. And I do think it matters that these people did not win in these important states.
Oh, very good.
And in terms of electoral politics.
And then keeping on kind of the focus on this disinformation, Annette McDermott asks, Renny, what are your thoughts about the role of media in stoking expectations regarding overly represented GOP polls leading up to the election, particularly by generational cohorts?
Wow, Annette, how are you? Wow, it's been such a long time. Oh, it's so good to hear from you. I forgot what the question was. Let me see. It was no, about the social media. Yeah,
the role of the media in stoking expectations.
Okay, I was just reading about that right before when I was putting my notes together, and there is more information on that Republican pollsters deliberately, perhaps, did some polling that indicated that there was going to be this red wave. So be careful what you wish for, right? And the reason it mattered is because there are polling averages that are done, and those polling averages that are done are the ones that often get reported in terms of what the trends are. In other words, it looks like the Republicans are going to win X many seats and so on. And so there's some concern now, and there's a terrific article actually that I was reading that was in New York Magazine, where somebody has really kind of done a study of this. And so they think that that's possible, and that the purpose of it, the reason they wanted to kind of boost, make it look like there was going to be a bigger red wave, was so that it would suppress Democratic votes. So my feeling about this is that it is, it's problematic. And I think that we should shoot straight about these things. And I do think it's a very important question. And I think this is going to be looked at by a lot of people, because once again, there's been criticism of the polling. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is an unusual midterm election. And so I don't know if any poll would have been exactly right. But I do think, and I've been reading people who really do polling for a living. These are not like opinion writers, who are very concerned about what might have happened in terms of this goosing of the results.
Yeah, and I mean, it does seem that the polling, there's always been something that hasn't been accurate in the past number of elections, whether it was going back where it was more, I remember the comment when Republicans did better than expected, it was, well, the conservatives are tough to, either they don't respond to polls or they're just not enough of them included in the polling sample to begin with. So it does seem like, that's why I asked the question about early voting earlier in our talk. Is there?
Oh, you mean in terms of polling?
Right.
That's, there are people working on that, Matt, to try to look, because there are so many variables here. I mean, it's so exciting. I mean, I have to say that I still get excited by all of this, because there's just so much to look at. And, everybody who's asking a question is raising something, that's really important for us to think about.
Absolutely. A person who prefers to remain anonymous said, "Thank you for your presentation. Well done. Roe only kept the Senate, but didn't do enough to keep the Dems in power as the House traded hands with the GOP, now in the leadership within the House. Biden will have to govern through executive order, as he hasn't united the country as he promised he would do. Governing through executive order can be very problematic in many ways. Arguably, Biden made things worse. The Dems are challenged with their record, which they didn't run on, as you point out: high inflation, immigration, rampant crime at an all-time high, and war. Let's not assume for a minute that the country is not at war with billions of dollars in military aid to fight a proxy war, plus the masking of student loans, which were marketed towards the youth who were duped into believing the loan forgiveness would take place, as the courts have recently denied this to be allowed. You are correct that we remain divided and most likely will remain this way beyond the next presidential election. I guess what kind of comes out of this is in that division, given that you talk about there's a little bit, there's concessions being made now, there's a return to civility, and that acknowledging what the election truth is. How do you think that affects us going forward?
The fact that Biden will not be able to get legislation passed. That's essentially the argument. Yes. I'm not sure what the question was. Exactly. I think it was like a comment, maybe more than.
Yes, I would agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult for Biden to accomplish the kinds of things that he would like to accomplish. I think there'll be a lot of litigation across the board on all kinds of issues that have remained unresolved, in large part because Congress hasn't been able to act on some of the most important problems that the country faces. And I think that will continue, and that will be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I notice we're getting close on time. Wendy Rollins asks the question we'll close out with. Will you take a stab at who will be the Democratic nominee for president in 24?
Oh my God, I have no idea. I mean, I think this is a tougher one in some ways than for the Republicans. I mean, I think for the time being, Biden is saying he's going to run. Not clear to me that he really will, and not clear to me who would come, who would rise to the top if he didn't. I think it's too early to know, in large part because we have to see what plays out over the next 2 years and what the terrain looks like. Mm-hmm. And what are the issues that are most salient in people's minds? And, what is it, to come back to this, not only, so what did the voters say, but what do the voters want? And I guess if you ask that question, what did the voters want this time? I guess I would say, I think they many voters wanted a return to civility and just a return to kind of norms that are not, it's what Mitch McConnell said. People don't want to be frightened by crazy talk.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And definitely an acknowledgement of the truth. I mean, when the people have spoken and the votes are counted and legitimately, I mean, Donald Trump with 2020, it's not like he was saying, I actually won and said, yeah, we're not going to listen to you. There was follow-up. There was attorneys general did look into what they needed to look into. And you even heard Bill Barr say, look, we've looked into all this. There is no fraud. Or no, fraud, not to the degree that it would have changed the outcome of the election. Yes, it seems like we have had more of a people speaking more civil tones, accepting the results of the people. I do concede when the election results are counted and have been verified. So. Thank you very much, Renny. Really appreciate your detailed analysis and very thoughtful, fact-based presentation.
Thank you. And just let me thank everybody again. And just to all the alums out there, thank you again just for taking the time and for just posing these absolutely terrific, thought-provoking, and well-informed questions. I'm so proud to be part of Trinity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Renny. And one thing just before, Carmen, I turn it over to you. For 2023, the speaker series is going to continue. One of the events we're going to have is a look at the Supreme Court with Justice Richard Palmer helping give us a view as to the Supreme Court and the decision-making process. So with that, that's just a sneak preview of what's coming up in 2023. There will be others, but Carmen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fulco, for your excellent presentation this evening, Matt for moderating, and Bonnie for organizing. On behalf of the Trinity Club of Hartford, we thank the audience for watching. We hope that you will attend future programs. Be well and good night.